He's kind of like the reversal of our show. In this, it's like someone else interviewing narcissists and
exactly
self-obsessed.
You know, there's a lot more like me.
Do you think so?
I guess, you know, we've got so many kind of true crime stories and kind of, you know, police procedurals out there now. What is it that makes MindHunter different from some of those?
Well, first of all, we have a visionary director, David Fincher, who is our executive producer, who's in charge of every aspect of the production. And David has a lot of history with this subject matter. He did the movie Seven, he did the movie Zodiac, both of which were sort of very much in this genre. And our show is exceptional in a number of ways. First of all, the writers have tried to be very authentic when it comes to the lives and the crimes of these serial killers, and to really show them in a realistic way, as opposed to the kind of stylized Hollywood way that they're often portrayed. And the fact that our show is based on a real story. So we're playing characters that are inspired by two real FBI agents, John Douglas and Robert Ressler, who were a part of the behavioral science unit at the FBI at the very birth of criminal profiling. And I just think it's a more, a deeper and more realistic look at these men and these crimes than you've seen on any of those other shows.
We travel around the country and teach FBI techniques to cops.
You guys mind if I bother you for a minute?
She was found cuffed and lashed to the bed.
What people won't do to each other. There's nothing people won't do.
How can we help?
I mean, David Fincher's talked about kind of taking away some of the mystique around serial killers. Would you say your perception of killers of this kind has changed as a result of this show, or has it kind of reinforced what you already thought?
I would say it has changed. I just had no idea. I'd never had been into serial killers. Like, I'd never watched, like, it's never been my thing. So spending so much time hearing the details of what these men were and are capable of was so horrifying to me. And then just the endless search into why and what is the motivation is just that, endless, that you can constantly ask questions and never sort of land on one answer. You know, and the show takes place in the late 70s at the birth of criminal profiling, and through the course of the first season, you see our characters starting to go, okay, organized, disorganized, premeditated, a spree killer. We start to do these labels, you know, that we are all very familiar with now in 2017. But even that feels rudimentary in that it's sort of you just never will fully comprehend what happens in the mind of a serial killer. So that sort of like endless deep dive was kind of mind-blowing to me in working on the show.
We should be using every resource we can, talking to the smartest people we find from the broadest possible spectrum.
Are criminals born? Or are they formed?
I mean, you must have done reams and reams of research on serial killers. What was something that maybe you didn't know about serial killers going into this show that you now are aware of?
Well, it's an endlessly fascinating subject. I mean, what you find is that although these men are very different, there are certain commonalities. Most of them have a very difficult relationship with their mothers. They're either abused by the mother, or they have a domineering and neglectful mother. Often there's an absent father or an alcoholic father. You often see them torturing animals when they're very young, or setting fires. They become arsonists. You know, there's a lot. Whenever somebody commits a crime of this kind, they don't live a normal life up until the age of 25 or 30, and then suddenly become a serial killer. There are warning signs. Behavior reflects personality. So as you look back at the lives of these men, you can sort of see what the events were that led them. What were the triggers? What were the triggering events? How did this guy go from somebody who was an arsonist, and then now he becomes a serial killer. What was that evolution? So that's what we studied on the show, and it wasn't a subject that I knew a tremendous amount about before we started.
I mean, there's a kind of almost a morbid curiosity with serial killers. I mean, what is it that makes this such a kind of appealing and enduring subject matter for dramas, I guess?
That's such a good question. I think it's that it's constantly happening. There's always new and fascinating cases, and it's impossible to truly understand the motivations, all the motivations. And so it's constantly looking for why and never really getting an answer.
And I think that these men commit such heinous, brutal crimes. And I think that for those of us, who can't fathom how could they possibly do these things, it's a fascination with the unknown. They're so different than us. We have to look at them and say, my God, how did this guy get to this point where he felt that he needed to do these things? We had an event just recently in Las Vegas where a man named Stephen Paddock committed mass murder and killed 58 people and injured hundreds more. 64-year-old guy, and suddenly one day he wakes up and decides he's going to commit this kind of a crime. Why did that happen? What were the events that led him to that point? What triggered it? It's a fascinating subject. There's a lot to understand.
It is not our job to commiserate with these people. It is our job to electrocute them.
We can't like everything we do. We're talking to serial killers.
Serial killers.
New terminology.
I'm trying to warn you, your attitude is going to bite you in the ass.
I mean, the series itself, based on the 2 episodes I've seen, it focuses on a lot of kind of conversations rather than your standard chasing after serial killers. What was the most powerful scene, the most memorable scene, or even the most difficult scene that you've done on this series so far?
Great question. I would say it's hard to pick one specific scene because they're all so different. But for me, when Holt and I are in the rooms with the serial killers, and you get the opportunity to do these 15-page scenes over the course of a day, and really lose yourself because the scenes are so long and complicated and psychological, and there's so much going on. The serial killer expressing their story, and we're digesting that, and we're also finding new ways to get them to open up. So there's a lot to play as the actors and a lot to explore psychologically. And so those scenes in those rooms, there was just so much going on. Those are probably my favorite.
You're developing a pattern of behavior that will not sustain you here. Agent Ford, if you leave, I can't help you.
There's no procedural rule book for how to talk to these people.
If any of this is going to work, we need to talk to more subjects.
You want truffles? You gotta get in the dirt with the pigs.
And I mean, at the heart of the show, there is this ongoing debate of nature versus nurture. Do you feel like you sit on one side of the fence, or do you feel like it's maybe a part of both when it comes to serial killers?
That's a really interesting question. The guys that we know who are in law enforcement, people like John Douglas, who wrote the book MindHunter, and other FBI agents that I got to know and speak with, what they'll say is, the analogy that they like to use is, if you're going to bake a cake and you have eggs and butter and milk and flour, sugar, and all the ingredients that you would normally put into a cake, but just as you're putting it in the oven, some motor oil spills into the batter. When that cake comes out of the oven, is it possible now to remove the motor oil? It's not. So for those men, they don't feel like rehabilitating these criminals is something that's particularly easy to do, particularly with all the problems in our prison systems. I personally think that I would come down on the side of the argument that is nurture. I think those very early days of a child's development are crucially important. And if he doesn't have a loving mother, and if he's traumatized, if he's abused, I think that in many cases, you never recover from that.